Now, unless you've been living under a rock, you'll know that climate change and our own impact on the world as a whole, be that through carbon emissions, through the pollution of our daily activities, our purchase habits, they all play a huge part in destroying the world fundamentally. And we've only got one planet. But, what can each of us do? What's this got to do with our pets' health, the way we care for our pets? Well, it's really important that we look closely into almost every aspect of our lives. And I think you'll be surprised at actually the impact that our pets have on the environment. And the area that this is most apparent is in what we're actually feeding them. This is a problem that is all too apparent and was made all too apparent by my fantastic guest in today's masterclass. I am a big fan of this man. This is Dr. Ernie Ward. He is a veterinarian, as you'll hear. He has dabbled in lots of different areas, and dabbled, that's not really a fair word. He's dived deep and he's become a real industry leader in a lot of different areas within the pet and the veterinary space, and is someone that I certainly look up to and have done from a distance for some time. So I was very excited to get this opportunity to speak to Dr. Ward about the impact that what we feed our pets has on the planet and how each of us can make a difference. This last part is really important as well. We might feel that we're only one person, but through simple, small changes, and sometimes very simple changes, they really add up. Thinking of the number of dogs and cats across the planet. If all of us made a small effort to examine those parts of our lives that really we can change, then who knows what's possible. So with that in mind, let's jump in to today's conversation. Dr. Ernie Ward, it's my absolute pleasure to be talking to you today. Thank you for joining us on the show.
Oh, Alex, it's my pleasure. And I'm a huge fan of all the work that you've been doing for the past few years. I got to tell you, you do a great service for pet parents all over the world. And you've certainly reached all the way to North America and where I live in North Carolina.
Oh, well, thank you very much for those kind words. And you've been, like a bit of an inspiration to me with what I've been doing. But before we jump into kind of the meat of what we're going to talk about, I'd love for you to give our listeners a bit of a background into maybe not all of the work you do, because we'll probably take up a whole podcast episode in itself, but a brief background about, your life as a veterinarian, and then what made you aware and really interested and dive deep into the environmental impact of the pet food industry.
Yeah, great question, Alex. I've been a veterinarian now for almost 30 years, so a little bit ahead of you for sure. And just like many people in America, I treated primarily dogs and cats, small companion animals. I dabbled with exotics and with large animals, from time to time. But, the bulk of my work was always done in the clinic. I opened several clinics over the course of my career, got into some pet retail settings. So did a lot of interesting things, that you would probably relate to in Australia. And so over the course of my career, I was always very focused on preventing illness and extending longevity and quality of life. And so that's what really backed me into the study of nutrition. So about 10 years or so into my clinical practice, I really started focusing on longevity and quality of life. And as I mentioned, that led me to obesity and nutrition, because obviously of all the things that you do to extend the quality of life and lifespan of your pet, it's what you feed it. And so that's where I became really interested. I started an organization called the Association for Pet Obesity Prevention back in 2005. And we now are, one of the global leaders around pet obesity and topics associated with it. At the same time, I'm a lifelong vegan, or my adult lifetime. I'm an adult vegan. And so, I was beginning to explore using alternative protein diets, plant-based diets for dogs, and not so much for cats, but that's a slightly different story that we'll touch on in a little bit. But as I started going down the health route of plant-based diets, so what are the health advantages potentially of feeding different protein sources to dogs and cats? I started really coming to grips with the environmental impact, which is what we'll talk about some today. And so that's kind of leads us up to where we are today. I have I'm no longer active in clinical practice. I sold the last of my clinics a few years ago. I now have a couple of businesses that I am a co-owner of. One of them is called Affordable Pet Labs, which actually we have veterinary technicians or nurses that go to people's homes and procure different lab samples, blood and urine and different lab samples. And then, of course, we allow them, to get the results to their vet or whomever they choose to do it. I also am a co-owner of a company called Vertical Vet. We have about 1,200 vet clinics in the United States that are members. And we offer a wide variety, whether it's ordering their supplies or giving them educational materials and training, which is what I'm in charge of in the company. So it's been an interesting career. Many people, if you follow me on Instagram, you'll see I also do a lot of endurance athletics. I'm a longtime Ironman athlete. I'm a triathlon coach and a personal trainer. So I have this other life, but I love endurance events. And like many Australians, I love surfing. I mean, that is really my family's passion, and I love paddleboarding, long distance paddleboarding. So if you're interested in that, the M2O or the Molokai to Oahu race this year will be virtual once again. So I'll be participating again. So if you're into that kind of endurance event, but yeah, that's it. 2 kids, they're all grown, beautiful wife I've been with since 1986, kind of the same story.
Well, that's not the same story as most people, Ernie. I'll tell you that. I don't know how you have time to fit that all in. It's amazing. And I guess anyone who says that, a vet is, all they do is, or all they're destined to do is be in a consult room, then, that's proof that there's so much that vets get involved with, across all kinds of different industries. So with that in mind, with your kind of the vegan interest, and that's our impact on, on the planet and on the world, I think a lot of people will be surprised, and I certainly was when I, picked up your book, surprised about the size of the impact that the pet food industry and particularly the meat footprint that our dogs and cats have. So what kind of size are we talking about so people can have a picture of that?
Yeah, and that's another excellent starting point. So basically, like many people who lived a vegan lifestyle or plant-based vegetarian, you eat less meat. I kind of assumed that my pets weren't a part of the problem. In fact, for all these years, I assumed I was the hero of the story, right? I'm the guy. I'm not the guy who's contributing to climate change. I'm not the guy who's causing animal suffering, because I don't eat them. And I was really oblivious to sort of the environmental impacts in particular and suffering that pet food contributed. And then a colleague, Dr. Gregory Oken from University of California at UCLA, published a study in 2017 that really shook me and made me become much more active in proclaiming this message. And that actually was the catalyst for the book. And of course, Greg, he's a fantastic researcher. But he published a study where he looked at, okay, how much meat in the United States is actually being fed to dogs and cats. Okay. So it's a pretty simple premise, a difficult calculation to ascertain, but that's what he wanted to set out. So how much of all the meat that's being produced, and it's complicated because remember, a lot of the meats that are being fed to dogs and cats are not human grade. They're not fit for human consumption. So they're considered to be waste. So, does that factor into it? And he said, well, we'll kind of discount the waste materials. We'll just look at actually the meat. And at the end of his brilliant, elegant paper, he concluded that about 25 to 30%, and there's a slight variation because depending on how we define meat and actually consumption, but about a quarter of all of the meat produced in the United States, that's chicken, that's beef, that's pork, is being fed to dogs and cats. And that's when I really woke up, right? Because a quarter of all the meat produced, about 30% of all the greenhouse gas emissions associated with meat production are due directly to pet food. That's whenever, as a vet, I said, okay, I'm a part of the problem. I'm not the hero of the story after all. I've got to do something to solve this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's a really good differentiation to make, I guess, the premium cuts of meat and the byproducts. But the byproduct, just using the byproduct still wouldn't necessarily excuse that, because I think another thing, and there was lots of things that I was completely unaware of, is I guess how much those byproducts are propping up the meat industry. So they're not just, so they're actually not just, oh, well, if they weren't being fed to pets, then it wouldn't really matter. They'd just be going in the garbage, because that's not true, is it?
No, it's not. And in fact, it's a huge profit center for meat industry. In general terms, it's about 20% of their profit. So selling waste materials to pet food companies, it's a serious amount of money. And that's why, again, they're very, I would say, a focused lobby. So in the United States and really around the world, they intensely scrutinize any legislation, any rules or regulations that might somehow impact it. I mean, you've seen it in Australia. I mean, almond milk and oat milk are being now challenged to use the word milk. And we've seen this, of course, all across the globe. And so, it's those kind of little things that you say, wow, okay, this is sensitive, right? And that's why we're beginning to see now, at least in the United States and in parts of Europe, particularly the UK, there a backlash by the meat lobby against pet foods that are using analogs as well.
Okay. And is the problem, so I guess because we'll come on to the alternative diets and things a little bit later, but I wonder, is the problem actually getting worse as people are looking for those premium cuts, so they're rejecting the byproducts? So even though, it's not ideal that we're using the byproducts or whatever, that we're using more, prime cuts, if you like, and also people looking more towards kind of raw diets and BAF and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, Alex, I love it because this tells me that you actually critically read the book, because that's one of the key points I try to make with my co-author, Alice Oven from the UK. This was the most concerning thing to me. And look, the BARF diet originated in Australia, so you guys are all too familiar with it. And I don't want to get into a debate over the pros and the cons and the particular issues around the health attributes are therefore of potentially of a BARF type of diet. But I do want to say, as we've switched to more premium cuts, more human grade cuts, then that just means there's less, for humans. And this is actually driving the cost of meat up globally. And it's interesting because during the research of the book, we interviewed people from all types of industries, including many from traditional meat. So whether it's pork, beef, and chicken, we interviewed everybody for this. And you could tell that they even had concerns about pet food being diverted. Human grade meats being diverted to pet foods, because they felt like that didn't allow them to get meat to humans around the globe. So, it's a very multifaceted problem, but you're absolutely right. As we move towards raw diets, BARF diets, high grade, human grade, then that just means that those cuts aren't going to be used for human feeding.
Yeah. Yeah. And, what about fish and other things? Because I guess we've got our cats, they love fish. Hey, I'm not part of the problem, but fish is on a knife edge, isn't it? Fish stocks and everything like that as well.
Yeah, it really is. And if you haven't seen the documentary on Netflix, Seaspiracy, I encourage you to. Obviously, the Great Barrier Reef, where your hometown, your home is in Australia, has just been devastated, because the impacts of overfeeding in Southeast Asia directly impact the Great Barrier Reef. So, we are all interconnected, especially from an oceanic sea life perspective. But, Alex, it's interesting about one of the things that I brought out in the book was even things like human trafficking. There've been many international investigations that have concluded that many of the fisheries, particularly off Southeast Asia, these are people that are indentured servants, for lack of a better term. In fact, that's some of the legal terms that they use. So it's a really dirty organization, so I think that a lot of the commercial fishing, we tend to view it in romantic terms, right? Like we think of the dairy farm as being, the family farm, with the 5 cows and the daughters out there milking it every 6 a.m. And of course, it's nothing like that whatsoever. It's a highly mechanized, there's about 100 cows in a circle and they're rotated around a machine. It's really robotic and looks like something from another planet. And same thing with fishing. These are big long line trawlers that are hauling in, thousands and thousands of fish. And sadly, in many cases, the vast majority of that is bycatch. Those are just fish that are killed because that's not what they're targeting, right? So everything else just dies. So fish is a tough one for me. And here I live at the beautiful coast of North Carolina, and it does break my heart because, right now, scientists estimate that 90% of the species, of sea life are gone. That's it. And, we're rapidly, just extinguishing this entirely, necessary ecosystem on our planet. And it breaks my heart. And I'll tell you too, Alex, one of the things that you guys are really in tune with in Australia, just the impact of algal species. So, algae in the ocean produce the majority of the oxygen that we breathe and need to live. And of course, as we deplete different fish species, that upsets the entire life cycle or ecosystem within the ocean, which means these algae then aren't kept in check, which allows them to overgrow, not producing more oxygen, but actually competing with each other. And so now we have, all types of really what we would consider environmental or biological contaminants. So these are not this is not helping us at all to remove predator-prey relationships. So it's a very interconnected, complex system. But when you damage one aspect over here, I mean, downstream or down under, the consequences are severe.
Yeah, absolutely. The interconnected nature of everything is just, I mean, I think it's only even now, I mean, I read the algae thing not that long ago, actually, and, it's only now becoming really better understood. But even then, I think it's only kind of, the tip of the iceberg that people realize.
And Alex, one of the things too with climate change, I mean, so like for every quarter temperature degree centigrade that we raise, I mean, this actually now causes different algal species to bloom. And again, not all of them are going to be helpful for us. So it's you guys had the horrible, bushfires a couple of years ago. In fact, I was able to interview one of the wildlife officers from Australia for a media story back then. And, it was really interesting because I think that for a brief moment in time, it was like when the Amazon forests were on fire, like the world got focused on climate change, right? I mean, and sadly, then they move on to the next shiny story. But the reality is, I think Australians definitely have a much more intimate relationship with climate change than many other places in the world, because you are an island and your island was on fire. And that's frightening. That must have been terrifying, no matter where you were in Australia. And to know that, wow, greenhouse gas emissions produced in China are a part of my problem here in Australia, that's eye-opening, and it's a call to action. And again, I applaud your government. You and New Zealand really have done a fantastic job of supporting a lot of these climate change initiatives and really being vocal about it as well. I mean, I'm very, very pleased with what you guys have done. Obviously, the U.S. politics has been a little in disarray for the past few years, but I think we're back in the Paris Accord, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's not go into politics. So, I mean, if ever there was a call to action, we've just heard it, that really the time is now, and we need to be looking at every aspect of our life. And I think also, I mean, we hear these, a lot of the problem, or a lot of the concern I have maybe, is that we hear all of these, stories of doom and gloom, and the world's going to end, and, we're all going to be baked as the temperature rises. And we sit here thinking, well, I'm just one person. Right. The choices that I make, or the small changes that I make, aren't important. But equally, there's that good meme of, this bit of plastic's not important, with 1,000 million people throwing it over their shoulder and into the trash. So people can absolutely make a difference, and pet food is one of those areas. And there's options available right now, aren't there?
Yeah, and it's no secret. I helped found. I'm no longer with. We kind of lost. We didn't agree on science, the importance of science and research, which is a big problem in big business. But I did co-found a plant-based dog food company. We were wildly successful, and that's part of the problem. When money enters a lot of these things, and I had to leave. But regardless, the solutions for dogs are pretty clear. I mean, dogs can thrive. They are omnivores, they are obligate scavengers, is the term I like to use. I mean, we know that these guys are opportunistic in what they eat. And so for dogs, I think the science, the evidence is clear and mounting that they can do very well on meat analogs. So whether this is plant-based proteins, or as we're going to see, in the book, we talk a lot about cell-based proteins and cultured meats and fermented meats. I mean, the future is really almost here when it comes to meat analogs. And you're seeing Beyond Burger, like you probably have Beyond Burger, Beyond Meat down in Australia now. I mean, like that's the kind of stuff that we're seeing very quickly come online. For cats, there are a couple of companies that are doing some fantastic work with cell-based chickens. And so that's going to be online most likely within the next 2 to 3 years. And so, I kind of have parked that aspect of what I'm talking about with cats until we have better alternatives, because really to do a plant-based diet with the current protein mix that we have, you wind up relying heavily on synthetic vitamins and additives. And that's not I'm not always comfortable with that. So I think it can be done. And if you're really interested, I mean, there are plenty of resources that can help you. And there's a couple of commercial diets available, worldwide. But again, there's only a couple for that very reason. But regardless, the meats that we see today, I think that the other issue is that people think of these meats that they're feeding their dog as being the ultimate in protein. And when you look at the risk of contaminants, when you look at the risk of adulterants, so we're talking about like plastics and metals and all these other things that are really in the processing, I kind of go, wait a second, they're actually, if you look at it from a scientific perspective, some of these plant-based proteins are probably superior. And people make a lot of to do about like bioavailability and digestibility. And that is a true concern. But the reality is we've done plenty of science, especially around like pea protein, for example. Dogs have a tremendous ability to digest that, no problem whatsoever. So the bioavailability of many of these plant-based proteins are equal to that of beef, or chicken. And so I think that we've really entered into an era where people need to be a little more open-minded. As you mentioned, it's a bit like throwing the one piece of plastic over your shoulder and saying, I can't make a difference. Well, even if you chose to feed your dog less meat, that is an impactful decision, because if tens of millions or hundreds of millions of pet parents around the world chose to do that, it would make a tremendous impact overnight.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. From, I guess, one thing that I think, well, we've already kind of touched on the fact that, well, but hey, Dr. Ward, these aren't species specific diets. My dog was, designed to eat meats and nothing but meat. The other thing that people, I think, worry about very much, and you touch on that as well, is safety. And, I guess, what would you say to that with view of the fact that we've had kind of the scare with the kind of pea, lentil, heart failure kind of link and all, and there's been numerous different scares, because these are still fairly new diets in the scheme of things, aren't they?
Right. And to be frank, that's why I left the company, because we have to do more research. And if companies aren't willing to fund the research necessary to prove safety, then, and again, you and I are scientists at heart. That's why we became doctors. And, for me, I couldn't work in an environment where research just wasn't going to be the focus, because you're right. Having said that, the preponderance of evidence, and it continues to mount, supports the usage of these alternative proteins. So the safety aspect is really interesting, because the DCM scare, remember right now, there's been no evidence whatsoever that there's a dietary link with this heart condition. In fact, the evidence points to the opposite, that there is no dietary link. We all know this is more genetically based. In fact, there was a peer-reviewed study of 150 of the most recent publications around dilated cardiomyopathy that concluded there was no link between diet and DCM. So, I think that there's been a lot of misinformation out there. I mean, you've done a good job of trying to cover it as neutrally as possible, and I applaud that, because we want to give people the facts without frightening them unnecessarily. Yeah. And I do think that it got sensationalized, at least in the US and the UK, and people tend to fear monger, and that's kind of our news cycle. But the reality is, I agree, we need more research. That's why with cats, you hear me I'm very reticent to endorse that whatsoever. Even in the book, I kind of keep saying, wait. I think it's coming, just wait. I'm in touch with the researchers, just wait. Whereas dogs, I think it's a much clearer picture. But getting back to like lentils and things like that, I think that, when I'm recommending, when I actually formulated this diet, I said, let's avoid as many of those problems as possible. Now, obviously, this was right before the DCM thing, but, I'm working with some of the top researchers in the world, and we all knew what to avoid and what sort of the matrix should look like as far as the nutrients. And so I felt very comfortable with that aspect of it. I'm not as fearful of it as anymore. I'm just trying to find a solution. And the great news is, I think we're kind of, Alex, at V 1.0, and I think that this is the first version. And I think that next year, as some of these cell-based proteins come online, we'll be at version 2. And then after that, it'll be version 3. And I honestly foresee within 10 years, Alex, most people will go to a restaurant and they will have an option to eat, a dead animal or something that was created, without killing an animal.
Yeah, and I think it'll get to the stage where it's significantly cheaper to do that well, which is probably what will really drive that behavior change. I wonder, just one thing that we haven't mentioned, and I know that are available in some parts of the world, is insect-based diets. Mm-hmm. Are they a valid option for, for reducing impact on the environment?
Yeah, and I devoted an entire chapter, and at the time there were none really that were out. Like, this was all speculative, but I was in touch with all the researchers of insect-based protein. I said, well, this is going to be an issue, and so I will say this: they are not for me, because animal welfare issues, I believe, are considerable around these insects. And look, that's just because I'm vegan. I believe, that all life, deserves to be free of suffering. So for me, there's that aspect. The animal welfare, I think there's an issue. Having said that, from a nutritional standpoint, it's perfectly fine. And we're starting to see, big companies like Purina in the United States and in Canada, they've launched an insect line of dog food. So I think you're going to see more and more companies migrate towards this. Remember that about 2 billion people every day eat insects. So most of them, of course, are in Asia. And usually it's considered more of a snack food. Like, we might have, I don't know if you have chips down there or whatever, fish and chips or whatever, like a snacky type street foods. And that's how it's primarily, served. But, we have a long history of eating insects. So, it's really, again, no surprise to me when you look at the protein makeup of insects. I mean, again, in the animal kingdom, the same 9 amino acids are preserved, which is why I like fungal proteins, because again, they're one order above plants. So they're more closely related to an animal than a plant. But regardless, when you look at those 9 amino acids, they tend to be in the same mix. Why? Because we're animals. And so insects make a really smart choice. And I think they are part of the solution. They're not part of my solution because I have issues around animal welfare. But, I do think from a nutritional standpoint, they seem to make a lot of sense.
And they're available now as well.
Right.
So even if we're thinking about it and we go, well, let's make the change today, and that's what happens to be on your shelf, then, that's something to think
and
about.
Alex, that's a really good point, because, towards the end of the book, when I talk about the future of foods and all this stuff, and because, I felt like, wow, a lot of this book is becoming aspirational. And sometimes, people, when it's like, well, it's not here now, he keeps saying, wait, but there are solutions. And that's why I mentioned insects and went heavy into the science of insect-based proteins and pet foods, because I knew this was going to be available quickly. And you're right. Accessibility is the key to solving climate change, right? We have to have real solutions. Like electric cars were a dream a decade ago. And yet, I have a Tesla, so these are those things that slowly, creep up on us, and then it's everywhere. And I think that what I want to do was just be that early sentinel to say, hey, there's another thing to think about here. Don't overlook the impact that pet food is having on climate change. And we need to make sure that we're solving all of the problem in totality, not just, in silo.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess to finish off kind of this kind of chat, Ernie, I'd love to kind of touch on your first love, if you like, because the other way that we can reduce the impact with pet food is actually not feeding quite so much.
Feeding them less.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And obesity, it's all intertwined, because I think when I was very young, I was in vet school in college. My father, we grew up in the South. So Southern United States is known for deep fried everything, so fried chicken, fried everything, right? I mean, we fry okra, right? I mean, vegetables, And so my father, like his father before him and his father before him, all had severe cardiovascular disease. And so I witnessed from an early age, my father, having open heart surgery, nearly dying, scaring me, right? I mean, as a child, you really don't think of your parents being mortal. And yet here was this reality. And so I think I became very interested in longevity at that point. And that's actually whenever I switched over, I stopped eating meat. I stopped eating fried foods, because, I was like, well, it didn't work for my great-granddad, my granddad, and my dad. So I'm going to try something different. And it was really shocking to me, Alex, to go through this personal health journey and being literally sort of cast off by much of my family. My family has farming roots right now. I mean, we still are in cattle, in Georgia. And so, this is what I grew up with. And suddenly I'm going, hey, I don't think this is working out so well for everybody. I'm not going to eat it anymore. And yet they were like, oh, you're an extreme, what's wrong with you? And so I think that longevity and obesity all sort of started interconnecting for me. And I started seeing my patients, again, having more and more obesity, having, more and more health and obesity related disorders. I was seeing more diabetics, more crippled arthritics, more dogs with, kidney failure. All of these are directly related to obesity. And so that's really what sort of led me down that path. It was that longevity and quality of life. And, I've been really fortunate to work with a lot of, amazing researchers around the world on this, because, really what I was doing in the early 2000s was just raising the alarm. I think like I did with this book, I just, back then, nobody was talking about obesity as a health disorder or a disease in dogs and cats. And I was kind of the first to go, hey, wait a second, I think there's a problem here, and this is one of the things, Alex, I love about being a generalist, because, and I use the term a specialized generalist, because I think, you have to be able to focus intently on certain areas throughout your career. But a generalist perspective gave me this wide swath or perspective on, wow, there's a lot going on here with dogs and cats, and this guy's limping and this cat's diabetic and there's kidney failure over here. And I think specialists, again, when they start to look at a very narrow bandwidth of the cases, they don't connect the dots. So I'm a fan for generalists. So if you are a general veterinarian or a vet tech out there, I think we have a lot of power. But again, a long-winded way to say obesity is part of the solution for climate change, because we know that most people are overfeeding their dog or cat 25 to 40%. That's 25 to 40% extra meat, extra animals that are being farmed, extra farmland that's being diverted to feed those animals, to feed the pets, so there's a huge impact downstream of it. And I think that one of the other solutions is obesity. Although I will share with your listeners real quick, if I may, Alex, my father's passed on now, and obviously, unfortunately, but one of the last bits of advice he gave me, I had run for political office here as a Democrat. And so that's a more liberal progressive party. And I'm in a very conservative part of the country. And so my father had watched me sort of, do all this obesity stuff, and then he watched me, try to run for office, Senate here in this great state of North Carolina. And he was very sick at the time. And he pulled me aside and said, Ernie, I just wish once in your life you could pick something that you could actually win, that you could actually accomplish. He goes, because you've got this obesity thing. You're never going to beat that one. You got this environmental stuff. That's going to take decades and then politics, So Alex, I will say this. I think that no matter how daunting the odds may be, and really doesn't matter if it's a big issue or a very small issue, no matter how daunting and overwhelming and intimidating it may seem, we all have an obligation to try to make the world a little better. And that's really, what people like you are doing. That's what, I try to do in my own little small way. But we really, I think whoever's listening to this today, if you can just on the daily, just say, there's one little thing I'm going to do better. There's one little thing I'm going to do to try to make some positive impact somewhere beyond myself. I think, again, that just changes the whole world. And what I really hope, Alex, is that the younger generation, especially the younger Gen Zs, they really do seem to take a much broader worldview than any of the preceding generations, including my own Gen X. And I really am hopeful. Every day, I retain my enthusiasm and optimism for the future. And I hope, again, that your listeners can share with me in that hope and joy.
Absolutely. Well, this is one battle that we're all in together, and hopefully we will win, because the consequences of failure are pretty catastrophic. So with all that in mind, where can people go to learn more about this if their interest is piqued and they really want to dive into this? Obviously there's your book as well. I'd love you to tell everybody a little bit about that, and maybe any other resources that are really helpful to the pet parents out there.
Yeah, you can find me anywhere on social media or on the web, Dr. Ernie Ward. That's DrErnieward, Dr. Ernie Ward. You can find me at .com, on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook at drernieward.com. There is a book website called The Clean Pet Food Revolution, but you can find that also on drernieward.com. You can buy the book in Australia, or you can have it shipped to Australia, I guess, from Amazon. That would be the easiest way to do it. It's really an easy read. It's kind of this book that's kind of, I know one of the early reviews described it as this eco thriller disguised as a pet food book. But, we really do kind of paint a very broad picture of what's actually happening. And I think what I think people, the readers that have liked it the most, the fact that we got to interview all of the major players in the meat alternative space. So, I mean, we got to talk to all the people that are now in the multi-billion-dollar companies back before they were in the multi-billion-dollar companies. So it's a really fascinating read to sort of tell you what's happening, what's about to happen. So The Clean Pet Food Revolution, How Better Pet Food Will Save the World. That's the name of the book. You can find it on Amazon. But, really at the end of the day, what I want people to do, Alex, is to make talk to their vet, make an appointment, talk about their diet, talk about the pet's weight. If your vet is not talking to you about your pet's body condition, you need to ask. And if they don't want to answer, find another vet. Alex, the stakes are just too high. Of all the things that you can do to extend the longevity and prevent disease, it is what you feed your dog, and that dog or cat, and that includes overfeeding it. So, I just encourage everybody to have that conversation. And, Alex, I have no tolerance or patience anymore at my age with a vet who doesn't want to talk about pet food. It's just like, that is so foundational to medicine that, if you're going to ignore that, then what else are you ignoring? And you're just not a vet that I want to recommend. So, that would be my biggest call to action for people today. And if you want to follow me on Instagram or on Facebook or whatever, definitely, I'd appreciate that as well.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Ernie Ward, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you today for this, incredibly important topic, one that I think is becoming more and more in everybody's consciousness, and deservedly so. So thanks very much for the work that you do, and thanks for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure. And again, Alex, I'm a huge fan. I mean, you just continue to put out fantastic content like this. You really are telling stories that people need to hear all around the world. And I'm just a huge fan and honored to be on your show.
You're very kind. So I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Ernie Ward. I really would encourage you to pick up his book. I've read it. It certainly was very entertaining is not perhaps the right word. Educational, informative, surprising read. I'll leave links to that and all of the other details and information that we spoke about down below this video. I'd also love to hear, what you thought about this topic, what your thoughts are on how sustainable having pets is perhaps as a whole topic, or what the different options that are available in your area. I'd love to hear from you, so please let me know. But until next time, take care.